In this presentation, I'm going to look at the way the prehistoric house can be used to derive three other spatial principles that are equally important. In this sequence of slides, you can see what the basic transformation sequence is. The name we give to this linear chain of rooms, preceded by a porch, is Stoa. To begin with, I want to show you how the transformation can be seen in ancient Greek and Roman architectures. This is a reconstructed plan diagram of the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. Toward the top, you can see 13 freestanding single-room buildings arranged in a broken line. These buildings have something in common with the prehistoric house, because each one consists of a porch and a single interior space. However, they are also different from the prehistoric house because they do not have a forecourt. This is a reconstructed plan diagram of the Agora at Athens. You can see lots of examples of the spatial type of the freestanding porch and single interior space. What I want to do now is zoom in on the building marked with a big red dot. As you can see, this building is an aggregate of many linked spaces, but I hope you can recognise amidst them all the familiar figure of the porch and single interior space. From now on, I'm going to refer to this figure as the porched room. Now, unlike the examples we have been looking at so far, what is novel about this porched room is that it is not freestanding. It's embedded within the total aggregate of spaces that make up the building. We can imagine this total building complex was assembled slowly over time, and maybe, to begin with, it was no more than a single porched room, freestanding in a field or in a clearing in a forest. Returning to the aggregated building, I want you to notice the way the space directly in front of our porched room is also a porch, only it is a much larger porch, at least twice as deep and 4 times as wide as the porched room, and it gives direct access to a whole sequence of spaces stacked up alongside it, including the porched room. Once we have the idea that several rooms might share a porch, then we begin to notice there is a lot of porch sharing going on all over the Agora. For example, this building that is directly above our aggregate, it has 2 identical porched rooms. There is a party wall between them, but both of them lead into the same enormous porch. Try to imagine what it might be like to stand in that enormous porch and look out across the Agora. We can see from the plan diagram, if you were to do that, then you would be looking at another porch sharing building right over on the other side. I am talking about the long linear building labelled 16 on the plan. It has 20 cellular rooms. Each room shares a party wall with its neighbour, and all of them share the same enormous porch. I have already told you the name the ancient Greeks and Romans gave to buildings arranged like this. They called it Stoa. With the Stoa type of organisation, the large porch becomes the dominant element, and in some cases the line of shared party walls completely disappears. When that happens, the Stoa transforms into a very long linear space defined by perimeter columns and/or a perimeter wall, often with a row of columns or a wall down the middle. The Agora had several roomless Stoas. Numbers 25 and 22 are good examples. But let's return to the Stoa labelled 16. It is a very famous building, in fact, called the Stoa of Attalos, dating back to 150 BCE. In the 1950s, the Stoa of Attalos, then in ruins, was reconstructed for use as an exhibition building, and that is how it is used today. But what about the ancient Athenians? How did they use the Stoa building? In the ancient Greek world, a stoa was a place of exchange where items of all kinds were switched and swapped around. Such items would have included knowledge, news about what was going on in the world, contracts for the buying and selling of goods. We can find Stoa-type forms dating back as early as the 6th century BCE, but they also date forward throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern world. One reason why the Stoa is such a persistent form is because it is the basis of two other spatial types. They are the peristyle and the basilica. Both types first appeared in ancient Greek and Roman architecture, but they went on to become the dominant forms of the Middle Ages, where you can find them in Christian and Muslim architectures. To derive the peristyle, we need to imagine 4 stoas, each of approximately the same length, arranged around an open space. When 4 stoas are arranged in this way, our perception of the large porch changes, because now it faces across an open space to stare at an almost identical porch facing back. Number 19, shaded orange in this slide, is a good example of a peristyle. This slide sequence diagrams the Stoa to peristyle transformation. It's hard to find remains of ancient Greek peristyles, but there are plenty of Roman examples left to us. This is a view of the peristyle of the Villa Oplontis near Naples. In a sense, the peristyle returns us to the colonnaded court of the prehistoric house, but the psychodynamics are completely different because there is no longer a single dominant hut or megaron hall. Instead, we have the array of equally valued rooms looking onto the central court. The second spatial principle derived from the Stoa is the basilica. This is a reconstructed view of the agora at Assos. Notice it shows 2 stoas. The basilica principle is based on the idea of 2 stoas, like these, placed so as to address one another across an open space. Different cultures have different words to refer to this kind of open space. In Greek, it's called an agora, in Roman, a forum. This slide sequence diagrams the Stoa to basilica transformation. Unlike the peristyle, which remained open to the sky, the Romans had the idea of roofing over the space in between the 2 aligned stoas to create what is called a nave. As I say, the peristyle and the basilica were dominant forms throughout the Middle Ages. Here is a basilica type from quite early on in that period. It was built in Rome in the 7th century CE. It is named after St. Agnes. Here is a close-up view of the apse. And here's a view looking from one of the side aisles into the nave. By way of contrast, here is the plan of a building from the end of the Middle Ages. Notice it combines basilica and peristyle forms. It is the plan of Wells Cathedral in Somerset, England, and as you can see, the main body of the church is a basilica, while the cloister is a peristyle. This is a view of the cloister at Wells. Please notice how the look of this building is very different to that of St. Agnes. We call this style of architecture Gothic. Here is a view inside the church, looking down the nave. We see the same spatial pattern at Salisbury Cathedral, shown in this slide. Here is a view of the cloister at Salisbury, and here's a view inside the church, looking down the nave. And again, the same pattern at Norwich Cathedral. Here is a view of the cloister at Norwich, and here's a view inside the church, looking down the nave. The dominance of basilica and peristyle forms didn't end when the modern age began, but attitudes changed and the forms began to look very different to those of the Middle Ages. This is a view of the cloister of Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, built around 1500. Once we reach the modern age, we begin to know the names of the architects who designed the buildings. The name of Bramante, who designed this one, might be familiar to some of you. Most obviously, notice there is none of the frilly tracery that characterises Gothic architecture. Instead, these early modern architects turned back towards the ancient Greeks and Romans and tried to reinvent a classical system of ornamentation. As well as churches and cloisters, in the modern age, the Stoa began to be used as an organising principle for new building programmes. This is the Uffizi, literally the offices, in Florence. The Uffizi was designed by an architect called Giorgio Vasari and built around 1560. It was used as accommodation for the Florentine magistrates and as a place to store the state archives, and it was decorated with paintings and statues, all experimenting with the classical style. These kinds of office, archive, gallery type stoas began to appear in towns and cities across the whole of Europe. This is the antiquarium in the Archduke's residence in Munich. It was built around 1570. And here's one in a small town called Sabbionetta in northern Italy, built around the same time as the antiquarium. Another modern building programme that is often organised according to the principle of the Stoa is the library. This is the plan and elevation of Trinity College Library in Cambridge. It was designed by the well-known English architect Christopher Wren and built around 1660. This is how it looks today. One relatively late but very important innovation involving Stoas was in the area of what today we call housing. By following that innovation, we can travel with the Stoa from the 18th through the 19th and into the 20th century. This is the Place des Vosges, a landscaped square in Paris. It was built early in the 18th century. It's the first example of a residential Stoa. Here, 4 Stoa-type blocks are laid out to form a large open square. The Stoas themselves are aggregated out of the same basic housing unit, simply repeated and laid next to one another side by side. There are lots of these kinds of aggregated housing units all over London. This one is just down the road from Baker Street at the top of Portland Place. It's called Park Crescent. It was laid out around 1800. Again, we see the principle of repetition and aggregation of a basic house unit. In the 18th and 19th centuries, residential Stoas were built for affluent people, and it's not really until the 20th century that residential Stoas were designed in the name of what is sometimes called mass housing. Mass housing is a response to a perceived crisis in the supply of places for people to live. It has been considered as a specifically architectural problem for over 100 years now. Among the many architects who have addressed the housing problem, one of the best known is Le Corbusier. Corbusier's interest in mass housing began in the 1920s and ran through to the time of his death in 1965. Corbusier used the analogy of the bottle and the bottle rack to explain his ideas about housing. In Corb's analogy, the bottle is the dwelling unit. He conceived it as something universal. All dwellings are, like wine bottles, the same, as it were, cast from a single mould. With the dwelling unit conceived as a universal type of thing, it becomes possible to think of it as something that can be mass-produced and made available for replication and aggregation. The dwelling unit can be replicated and aggregated in 2 places. On the one hand, in the mind of the architect, on the other hand, in the actual built environment. The other part of Corbusier's analogy, the bottle rack, is a building frame, a device by means of which a mass of dwelling units can be stacked up together into a single building. The important thing to notice about the building frame is that it cannot, in itself, be imagined as arising out of the kinds of human behaviours associated with dwelling. The frame is something extra. Let's look at the way the dwelling unit relates to the frame. In this drawing, notice the way the large hand is sliding the entire dwelling unit, like a drawer, into its allocated position in the frame. Notice how the dwelling unit is a single L-shaped volume. Inside, it is arranged on 2 levels and subdivided with screens, but you can see from the image how the architect conceives the interior as a single continuous space. At the end, where the hand holds the unit, you see a double-height space with a balcony. The balcony serves as a kind of porch looking out to the world outside. Corbusier actually got to build some of his housing units after the Second World War. The most famous one is in Marseille. It was built between 1947 and 1952. Corbusier arranged for this photograph to be taken to show the unit in its ideal state of occupation, a mother sewing while her children play. Notice Corbusier has staged the photograph with the action happening on the threshold between the living room and the porch. Here is an external view of the Marseille block. Notice how the look of the block speaks of the themes of replication and aggregation. I want to pause now to ask about that other aspect of the Stoa, the shared porch. How, if at all, is that present in Corbusier's housing unit? Corbusier doesn't seem to have asked himself what happens to the shared porch when the individual porched room is translated into a universal object, produced en masse and then multiplied and stacked up in a frame. One of the most difficult aspects of stacked housing is the relationship between the individual dwelling unit and the shared city space outside. You probably all know what it is like to traverse a housing block arranged in this way. In order to get from the outside to any one of the dwelling units, a long journey is necessary. To facilitate that journey, you have to use additional spatial devices such as lifts, stairs, and corridors. It's not at all clear if the spaces we traverse on our journey from the city to the dwelling are meant to be public or private. They are ambiguous spaces, difficult to negotiate, both physically and psychologically. Sometimes, when we are in these kind of spaces, we feel alienated. Corbusier didn't really have an answer to this problem. One thing he did was to try to cut down on building costs by having as few lifts, stairs and corridors as possible. If you look at the section shown at the top in this slide here, you can see how Corbusier has designed the dwelling unit so that 2 of them interlock around a central corridor, hence the L-shaped form. The corridor is conceived as an extruded rectangular tube running at right angles between the paired units. This arrangement cleverly cuts down on corridor space, but it doesn't alter the ambiguous nature of that space. The point about the great porch of the ancient Greek and Roman Stoa is that it served as a specialised part of the city or town. It was a place of exchange, where individuals engaged with one another by exchanging knowledge and news, or by doing deals and striking up contracts for buying and selling goods. I've tried to show you how modern mass housing Stoas like Le Corbusier's ignore the psychodynamic principle of mutual exchange, but what, if anything, do they put in its place? We can begin to formulate an answer to this question by looking at the way Corbusier's living unit engages with the outside world. As I've already said, Each unit is equipped with its own individual porch. The porch is a double-height balcony linking the main living space to the outside world. The balcony connection provides the dwellers with an exterior view. However, the view doesn't show them a place they can step into, and neither does it show them a place of mutual exchange. The outside world the young woman is looking at here is an ideal of nature, of the sky, the sea and the mountains presented to her by the architecture as something distant and unobtainable. To end this presentation, I'd like to turn to another example of a mass house in Stoa. It's a little different to Le Corbusier's, perhaps even critical of his ideas. This Stoa was designed and built just after Corbusier's experiment in the late 1960s in a district of Milan called Galleratese, from which it takes its name. The architect was called Aldo Rossi. Notice the way the Galleratese seems to tiptoe across the ground on short, spindly piers with a more solid volume punctuated by windows resting on top. The dwelling units are in the volume on top, and the space circumscribed by the piers is an enormous porch. The porch provides a common entrance to the dwelling units, which can be accessed via 5 stair towers distributed along its length. Once or twice a week, a market takes place in front of the block, but it isn't clear if the enormous porch encourages the market or if the market would take place anyway. I wonder if Rossi's porch really does operate as a place of exchange, or is it perhaps just another portion of ambiguous circulation space, albeit a portion disguised in the image of an ancient Greek Stoa? I don't have a hard and fast answer to this question, but I do have a few observations I would like to make. This is an image of an urban scene, depicted by a 20th century painter called Giorgio de Chirico, by whom Rossi claims to have been influenced. Notice the Stoa-like form. The painting evokes a mood of anticipation, as if something is about to happen. This is a coloured drawing made by Rossi while he was working on the Galleratese. It has some of the same mood of anticipation as de Chirico's painting. From some of the things he wrote, we can see that Rossi was interested in the kinds of spatial types that I'm discussing in these presentations. He understood them as recurrent patterns of building that could be used and reused as a kind of ready-made language for generating architectural forms. The easiest way to understand what this might mean is to equate the spatial types with other things that recur in human environments. I mean simple things like roofs, wheels, words, bottles, numbers, colours, letters, and geometrical figures. There is no mystique about why these things recur. It's for the simple reason they are useful. These simple recurrent things don't belong to anybody. They are free, a kind of ready-made gift that already exists in the world that you have been born into. This is also true of the spatial types I'm discussing in these presentations. And part of becoming an architectural designer means learning how to recognise the types and practicing how to use them as design tools.